Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. To my old friend, Mr. Steinmeier, thank you for your kind remarks. But you know, I have to say something else. Thank you for your service. I never considered you just the foreign minister of Germany. I considered you the foreign minister for the human race. I'm serious. And that's just what we need right now. Let me start off on a somber note, if I may. I believe that we may be at a seminal turning point for our species over the next several decades, a decisive turning point. Now, I know that's difficult to say, and it sounds melodramatic, because there's been so many apocryphal prophecies over history about doom. But I want to share with you one statistic, and then you think about it. This little planet we live in is sustained by the blessings of the sun. And the sun interacts with the matter of this earth with photosynthesis and allows us to have life. It's as simple and profound as that. We human beings are the youngest species in the evolutionary scheme of things. We've only been here about 175,000 years as anatomically modern humans. We've done a good job proliferating. There are 6.8 billion of us now populating this planet, but we still only make up 1/2 of 1% of the animal biomass of the earth. That's all. But we're currently using 24% of all the photosynthesis available on earth. And we're moving from 6 to 9 billion people. It's simply unsustainable. We have become the monster species. We are devouring the potential to maintain life on this earth. There were two seminal events in the last 18 months that I believe represent the end game for the great industrial age that spanned 2 centuries based on fossil fuel energies. You recall back in July 2008 when oil hit $147 a barrel on world market? Prices soared. Inflation went through the roof. Remember when you went to the grocery store, basic food items became prohibitively expensive, and petrol for the car. There were food riots in 30 countries. And the reason this was happening is everything depends on fossil fuels. We forget that it's not just the petrol for the car. Our petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides, agriculture. All of our construction materials are made out of fossil fuels. Most of our pharmaceutical products are still fossil fuel based. Most of our clothes are petrochemical synthetics. Our power, transport, our heat, our light, our supply chain, logistics, it's all based on digging up the burial grounds of the Jurassic Age and using those vast carbon deposits to create one of the great short-lived civilizations in history. But when the price went over 80 a barrel, things started to change. And when it hit $147 a barrel, purchasing power plummeted. The entire economic engine of the Industrial Revolution shut off in July of 2008. That was the economic meltdown. That was the earthquake. The collapse of the financial markets 60 days later, that was the aftershock. We're still dealing with the aftershock and not the crisis. And this is what I call peak globalization. We now know the outer limits of how far we can globalize based on an industrial revolution propelled by fossil fuels. It's 147 a barrel. And the reason we've hit the end game, and we'll look back and see that month in July of 2008 as the end game, is because something called peak oil per capita. Do not confuse this with peak oil production. They're two different things. Peak oil production is when half the oil reserves of the world are used up on the classic Cubic bell curve in geology, and then it's over because you can't afford the price. There's some controversy about peak oil production. Some geologists say we're going to peak between 2010 and 2020. Some said we've already peaked. There are others who say maybe 2020 to 2030. But they're now arguing only about a few years. It makes relatively no difference in terms of changing the entire energy regime of the earth. And yes, there are other fossil fuels, tar sands in Canada, heavy oil in Venezuela, coal, but that's more CO2. But the reason we peaked at 147 a barrel is because of peak oil per capita. That occurred in 1979, at the height of the auto age. No dispute about it. If we were to distribute all the oil reserves in the world to everyone alive in 1979, that's the most each person could have. We found more oil since then, but population rose quicker, so you see where I'm heading. When China and India made a bid to bring 1/3 of the human race, fast growth, into an industrial revolution based on fossil fuels, the new demand pressure against the energy reserves was too great. Prices started shooting up. And the engine turned off at 147 a barrel. You notice the economy starting to grow a little bit. That's because we're replenishing the inventories. But what's happening? Oil's now back up to $80 a barrel. So what I'm saying, and I've challenged my colleagues, what I'm saying here is that as we try to regroup and grow the economy again, with all the developing countries in, we're going to keep going up with inflation, and we're going to keep turning that engine off at around 140 or 50 a barrel. There is no way to get through that wall. And I would challenge any of my colleagues to tell me how we're going to do it. So we're going to keep bouncing back, trying to regroup, bouncing back. It's going to be a very volatile period in this end game. Very dangerous period for many more decades. Fast forward, Copenhagen, December 2009, our world leaders from 192 countries come together to deal with the entropy bill for the industrial age, the spent CO2. 2 centuries of carbon use, and now we have so much CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere that we're threatened with climactic climate change. And we could be imperiling the ability of life to maintain itself in any form we know it on this planet. Our scientists tell us we may go up 3 degrees Celsius in this century. Now that's looking optimistic. But for parents here, let me put this in perspective. 3 degrees in this century of your children, that takes us back to the temperature on Earth 3 million years ago in the Pliocene. Different flora and fauna and different water cycles. And what's really crucial is how it affects water. For every 1 degree the temperature goes up on the Earth, the atmosphere absorbs 7% more precipitation. That throws off the entire ecosystem dynamics. That means more floods, more droughts, more wildfires. And as you know, we have 1 billion people going to bed hungry each night, and the FAO tells us it's because we're in real-time climate change in agriculture and our yields are going down. We've never seen 1 out of 7 people in the world ever go to bed without access to food, ever. It may get much worse. We, in Brussels, went to Copenhagen, the EU, hoping we could mitigate carbon at 450 parts per million by 2050, with the idea we'd only go up 2 to 3 degrees. Let me say 2 to 3 degrees is devastating. If we only go up 2 to 3 degrees, our scientists tell us we could lose upwards of 70% of all the plant and animal species on Earth by the end of the century. That's a mass wipeout. That's at 2 to 3 degrees. We have only had 5 waves of biological extinction in 450 million years of life on this planet. Every time there was mass extinction of life, it took 10 million years to recover the biodiversity we lost. As my wife says, we're just not grasping the enormity of this moment. It's eluding us. Some of us, I guess we have some faint recognition, others in denial, but if we understood the emergency of this moment, we would be in emergency mode and thinking as a human species. James Hansen, you'll recall, threw us a curve in Brussels because he said we had the numbers wrong. We were trying to talk the world into mitigating at 450 parts carbon per million. Maybe we go up 2 to 3 degrees and still survive. But as you know, nobody else wanted to play that game, including Mr. Obama. But James Hansen, the chief climatologist for the US government, the head of the NASA Goddard Space Institute, says when they looked at the geological record, they went under the oceans, it suggests to them, it shows that at 450 parts per million, and nobody even wants to do that, and listen to this, parents and grandparents, we go up 6 degrees Celsius in this century, and this is a paraphrase from our chief climatologist in the US, the end of human civilization as we've come to know it. Asleep. So here's my question. Copenhagen, world leaders came together, and it completely broke down in acrimony. Imagine the President of the United States having to break open a door and go into the delegation with the Chinese, South Africa, Brazil, to sit down. It was pandemonium, and it collapsed. And even though this was probably the most important meeting the human race has ever had, we couldn't cut a deal. So here's my question. Why were world leaders, government and business leaders, unable to actually anticipate or respond to the meltdown of the Industrial Revolution in such a quick moment? They didn't see it coming the day before, and they didn't know what to do the day after. Why were our world leaders not able to cut a deal on climate change, knowing that this imperiled the human race? The fault lies deeper than just the inability to come up with a new mechanism to regulate the global market or new carbon targets that we could verify. I believe the fault lies in all of us, not just government and business leaders, but all of us, because we continue to rely on 18th century ideas about human nature and the human journey, weaned in the Enlightenment, at the dawn of the market era nation-state governance, to address 21st century biosphere challenges in a global economy. It's a complete disconnect. For 1,500 years, the church had the final word on human nature, and it was pretty clear. Our babies are born in sin, depraved. Salvation waits till the next world with Christ. 1,500 years, that was the dominant view. In the early Enlightenment, our philosophers began to challenge that frame of reference about human nature and the human journey. John Locke, the great political philosopher of the Enlightenment, said, actually, little babies are born tabula rasa, blank slate. What you put into them, you get out of them. Except, he had one little exception, there is a predisposition, he said, to acquire property. I don't know why they let him go with this. Somebody should have caught that one. Adam Smith, the great Scottish economist in the Enlightenment, said, actually, little babies are born and their drive is to seek autonomy and independence. And they seek material self-interest in the marketplace in a competitive struggle. In the 19th century, post-Enlightenment thinkers, Jeremy Bentham said, no, little babies are born and the drive is to seek pleasure over pain, and we are utilitarian to the core. And there are business schools in the United States, I will not mention, who still believe that. Charles Darwin, later in the century, said, no, every species, every organism is born with a drive to perpetuate themselves and reproduce their survival. Then at the end of that century, Sigmund Freud closed it by saying, no, that little baby is born with an insatiable sexual appetite and must continually extinguish libido. Okay. Would every parent that's ever had a child, please raise your hand. Everyone that's had children here, raise your hands, please. Got to get rebuked. You're not reproducing enough here. May I ask all the parents and grandparents here, is this what's happening when you're looking at that baby? This baby is depraved, evil, full of sin, rational, detached, calculating. Their drive is to be an autonomous little agent to pursue their self-interest and extinguish their libido. If that is human nature, we're likely doomed, really. I don't really see any scenario in which 6.8 billion human beings can come together in an interconnected, interdependent, just, and sustainable global economy if each one of us are depraved, rational, calculating, detached, involved with our own autonomous self-interest and our pleasure-seeking libido. Do you? Does anyone see how we're going to do this? And I know when you exercise foreign policy, you constantly came up with this over and over again. In the last 10 years, and I should say our nation-state model that was weaned during the Enlightenment actually reflects that view of nature. The nation-state is supposed to be an aggregate of our thinking about human nature. And so the nation-state is a sovereign individual who represents the material self-interest of its citizenry, involved in a competitive struggle in order to seek their reproduction and survival as best they can. That's geopolitics. And then we wonder why we can't globalize the world. In the last 10 years, scientists from a range of fields, evolutionary biology, neurocognitive science, child development, a range of fields, have been making some breathtaking discoveries that are changing our concepts of human nature and forcing what I think will be a great global debate on who we are and what is our journey. And it's challenging these ideas we've long held that have been embedded in our parenting styles, our schools, our business practices, and our governing models. Let me take you back to Italy, Parma, Italy, early 1990s, a sleepy little laboratory, nothing going on here. They were studying a macaque monkey, and they put an MRI brain scanner on the monkey's brain, and they watched as the monkey tried to open up a nut, and certain neurons lit up in the monkey's brain. By sheer serendipity, and this is how these things happen, a human being accidentally walked into the laboratory right after the experiment, and he looked at the nuts and was hungry and took a nut to try to open it himself. Well, the macaque monkey was completely flabbergasted. What is this beast in here? This is my laboratory. And he's sitting there staring at the trainer as the trainer's opening the nut, and the macaque is not moving. They look at the MRI machine, and the same neurons were lighting up when the macaque monkey was observing the trainer open the nut as in when the macaque was trying to open up the nut. They had no idea. They thought there was an actual mistake in the machine, I think. They started looking at other primates, especially chimpanzees with advanced neocortex, and then human beings. Over and over again, they found that if a participant had an MRI machine and they were experiencing pain, pleasure, joy, disgust, rejection, whatever feeling, different neurons will light up. Then if that same person observes someone else with the same feeling, maybe disgust or joy or rejection, the same combination of neurons would light up when they were observing it. They discovered mirror neurons. This is only part of these discoveries in the circuitry of human beings and some of our primate relatives we're discovering. We're learning that all animals that nurse their young, the young play and groom. And you notice when you see other little tiger cubs playing, or you notice, or little dogs, they look just like the way we play when we're kids. And when they groom each other, it's not just about hygiene. That was a 1950s idea. They're creating social bonds. They have to be sensitive to the needs of others, because mammals are social. They nurse their young. Primates are big, very social, with big neocortex. And guess what? The most social animal in the world? Human beings. That little baby is not pre-wired for aggression and violence and narcissism and utilitarianism. Every parent knows this. That little child from the get-go with that mother and father is seeking attachment, and both the parent and the kid is constantly seeking connection, intimacy, a sense of giving and giving gifts, of belonging. And if the parenting style is just good enough, the parent will give that child a sense of attachment and belonging and intimacy and just enough trust so the child can then explore the world. If the parenting is bad, if it's corporal punishment, if it's abusive, if it's avoidant behavior, you're going to turn out a child whose secondary drives dominate violence, aggression, etc. And you can create a whole generation of monsters with bad parenting, bad education. We have discovered Homo empathicus. Empathy is a very, very difficult and interesting phenomenon. It isn't just I feel your pain. It's both an emotional and cognitive response. When little babies are in the nursery and one baby cries, the other babies will cry. They just don't know why they're crying. That's an empathic, primitive response. Around 2.5 years old, your child can identify themselves in the mirror. That's when empathy starts to mature, because then the little child knows I'm an individual and you're an individual. So if I'm feeling something, I know it's coming from you, but I'm feeling you as if it's me, because there are two different identities. At 8 or 9 years old, your child learns about birth and death. That matures empathy to the next stage. Because when we understand that we are alive, that each moment is unrepeatable, that we have a personal history, and we die, then we understand how vulnerable life is, how fragile it is, and actually how tough it is to be alive. When we think about it once a day, boy, is it tough being alive, whether you're a fox in the woods, out there in the wild, or a human being. When we empathize with another, think about when you empathize with a spouse, a sibling, child, whatever, a companion animal. When we empathize, we actually feel that other person's individual one and only life. We smell their death, and we celebrate their life, and we feel their plight and condition and their struggle to flourish and be. And we're rooting for them, and we show compassion, and we reach out because we've been there too, and we both are struck with awe about life, and we celebrate each other's life. That's what empathy is all about. There is no empathy in heaven I can tell you even before we go there, if there is no empathy in heaven. Don't look for it. It doesn't exist. There's no empathy in utopia. Empathy is the opposite of utopia. In paradise, in heaven, there's no mortality, so there's no suffering. There's no finality. In utopias, that's beyond mortality. Empathy requires the knowledge of the existential, finite, special, unique quality of each journey in each unrepeatable moment. And we're there for each other, rooting for each other to struggle and be the most they can. Their joy, their pain, whatever it is. So an empathic civilization doesn't give us a perfect world. Empathy is based on accepting each other's imperfections. If we are wired, soft-wired for empathy, how does it mature? And can we imagine in this room here in Berlin tonight, can we imagine extending empathy so that we consider the entire human family as extended family and empathize with the human race? Can we imagine our fellow relatives in the evolutionary scheme as extended family, our animal relatives? Can we imagine the biosphere as a common community that we live in and are completely dependent on? If we can't even imagine this, I'm going to say to you tonight, I do not think we'll make it. We have colonized the planet, we filled the earth, and if we cannot begin to think as a species related to our fellow relatives, the other species in one biosphere, how do we make it on this planet? So the question becomes, by the way, you're saying at this point, I came out here to hear this guy talk about biosphere consciousness and the world coming together. Please. This is the most naive guy I've ever heard. The whole world's fighting. There's conflict. There's genocide going on in various places. There's hatred. There's all sorts of different levels of expression of the human mind. And this gentleman's up here telling me about biosphere consciousness. I don't think that's human nature. We do kind acts, but here's the problem. Our historians have given us kind of a bad picture of ourselves. I don't mean to pick on the historians, but if you're students of history and you like to read history books, what are you reading when you read history? Wars, mayhem, Holocaust, exploitation, redress of grievances, social disruptions, upheavals, new technologies, and occasionally they'll talk about rights, etc., but that's in relationship to redressing grievances. The reason is our historians, and historical consciousness really started in the 19th century, our historians chronicle the pathological moments in history. That's because they're newsworthy. Why are they newsworthy? Because they're not ordinary. So they get our attention. They trigger the fight-flight mechanism. We say, whoa, that's important. Holocaust. And the reason it's important is because that's not the way people live day to day. But they become newsworthy, so our history is a skewed picture of all the pathological moments in our sojourn, and we get a pretty bad picture of ourselves. If that's who we were, we would have perished a long time ago. We would never have been here today. George Frederick Hegel said, it's a great line, happiness are the blank pages of history. Those are the periods of harmony. They're not in the history books. So when I went back to do this other history, I couldn't rely on historical accounts alone. So I had to rely on an economic frame of reference to look at history and narrative, because the history of the evolution of our social side is all there. It's in the narratives. From Gilgamesh to cinema in the 21st century, it's all in the narrative. And it gives us some hope, guarded hope, about where we're headed. But it doesn't give us a guarantee we'll get anywhere. I believe the great changes in consciousness in history occur because consciousness changes. The way our brain is wired today is not the way a medieval serf's mind's wired, or a forager hunter 40,000 BC. So what are the mechanisms, the process upon which consciousness changes? Because if we know it, then we can get a clue as to where we need to go politically, as you say. I think the great consciousness changes in history occur when new energy revolutions converge with new communication revolutions. Those are the big economic moments. They change, as you Germans say, Gestalt. They change temporal spatial orientation. They change the perspective on how people view their reality. I'll give you an idea of convergence of energy and communication. You study the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, in anthropology. We care about them because the Sumerians were the first, this is ancient Iraq, 3500 BC, they were the first to harness the sun's energy in photosynthesis in cereal crops, barley and wheat, with big, huge irrigation systems, hydraulic agriculture. Before that, people lived in little villages, little garden agriculture and pastoralism. All of a sudden, they indentured thousands of men to build these huge canals to control the floodwaters for stored grain, the energy. They had to create craft skills to make the dikes. They had to create the royal granaries, the royal roads, the distribution, extremely complex. It required a communication revolution to organize it, and they invented cuneiform. And what is so fascinating, wherever you see these great hydraulic agricultural civilizations, complex energy, grain, Middle East, India, China, Mexico, independently humans come up with writing, not knowing other people had done it. That's amazing, to organize it. If we go, let's skip up to the 19th century, first industrial revolution, communication, energy converge. The print press had been around since Gutenberg, but in the 19th century we introduced steam power into print, linotype and rotary, so you could really mass produce print very cheaply. We introduced public schools and mass literacy in Europe and America between 1830 and 1880, and we created a literate mind that could organize and manage coal, steam, and the first industrial revolution. Try to imagine organizing coal, steam power in the first industrial revolution, all of its complexities, with manuscripts, codex. Couldn't do it. 20th century convergence of communication, energy, electricity, the telegraph, transitional, the telephone, cinema, radio, television, etc., became the communication vehicles, electricity, to manage, as command and control, the internal combustion engine, another German invention. Seems like these are all German inventions. And that gave us a new era in history, which is now sunsetting. The energies of the second industrial revolution are sunsetting. Does anyone think coal, oil, gas, and uranium are sunrise energies? And they're on life support infrastructures. When the communication and energy revolutions come together, the communication not only organizes these more complex energy regimes, they change consciousness. Fundamentally. Every forger-hunter society in history, their communication was oral language to organize the gathering and hunting. Every one of them created mythological consciousness, without an exception. The great hydraulic agricultural civilizations used script, and every one of them created the great religions of the world. The Abrahamic religions in the West, the people of the book. Judaism, Christianity, Islam. In the East, Buddhism. All of them had script. They created theological consciousness. In the 19th century, first industrial revolution, the market economy and nation state, print allowed us to extend the central nervous system, and we created ideological consciousness and geopolitical thinking. Everywhere you see the first industrial revolution, ideological consciousness. In the 20th second industrial revolution, electricity communication gave rise to psychological consciousness. The early psychologists sometimes were interchangeable with those who were experimenting with electricity, because electricity was neither material or immaterial and conjured up metaphors of how the mind and nervous system operate. Grandma couldn't think psychologically. These are really changes in the wiring of the brain. If my grandma were at a family gathering and I could see she's getting irritated and she drops a glass on the floor and I spot it, she just did it. And I say, Grandma, step over here for a moment. We need to have a chat. That was a real passive-aggressive act. I saw it. There's some transference and projection going on here. Obviously, when you were a child, there was a family gathering, something happened with the siblings. You understand what I'm saying? Grandma does not have a clue and could not respond to what I'm saying, because she thinks ideologically, theologically, maybe even mythologically, a little salt over the shoulder, knock on wood, but not psychologically. So it does change over history. And when these energy and communication revolutions come together and change consciousness, they extend empathy. This is not linear. There are blowbacks. There are holocausts. There are bad, dark moments. But jerkily, they move forward. Every forage or hunter society in history with oral language only extends shouting distance, so you can't empathize beyond the blood ties of your tribe. Everyone in the other village is not a human. When we get to the great hydraulic agricultural civilizations, script extends the central nervous system so that we can extend communication beyond just shouting distance. In every hydraulic civilization, empathy began to extend from blood ties to associational ties based on religious affiliation, a bigger net. All of a sudden, all the Jews start to empathize with Jews as a fictional extended family. Christians did it with Christians, Muslims with Muslims. When we get to the first industrial revolution, getting close to home here, geopolitics, the print revolution and coal steam power allowed us to extend commerce and trade, create more complex societies over bigger regions, not little principalities, but national regions. We created the fiction called the nation state. There was no Germany, there was no France. We created the fiction, put in standardized education, created our new history, and all of a sudden Germans start empathizing with Germans thinking, well, this is my extended family, no longer the village. Americans start doing the same thing. So what I'm suggesting here, how big a leap is this? With all the spotty problems in history, we have seen some change from empathy extending just to blood ties and everyone else is the alien other, and then to religious associations, and then to national identity. And we won't lose those, but isn't it possible we could make this next step if we're moving to a globally connected economy in real time, and we now realize we're in a one biosphere that's in trouble, that's our community, is it a big stretch to believe we could take the next little step and begin to empathize as a species in a common biosphere? If we can't do that, globalization will fail. I teach at the Wharton School. It's the oldest business school in the world. I teach CEOs. They have to suffer through 5 weeks, come back for advanced training. I guess I haven't done a very good job, but they come back for advanced training. And I say to them, you have to understand that commerce is not a primary institution. It's a secondary institution. There's no example in history where people first create commerce and trade, then later create a society and a culture. There's no example where people first create a government, then create a culture. We call the culture the third sector as if it's less important than market and government, but culture is where we create our story, our narrative. It's where when we all become more differentiated, we have to integrate. So we extend empathy to more and more associational ties, and we create social bonds of trust. It's those broader social bonds of trust, empathy is the mechanism to do it, that allows us to engage in commerce and trade. George Simmel wrote a very good book, The Philosophy of Money, great sociologist. Commerce and trade lives off the social trust we create that anonymous parties can exchange promissory notes and still think it's going to be okay. Commerce can deplete the trust, and when that happens, we're in trouble. That's what's going on today. Global commerce has depleted the trust. There's populism, there's xenophobism, and what's happening in, with my friend George Papandreou, what's happening in Greece and around the world, it's going to get worse. It's going to get a lot worse. And it's not going to be just Spain and Greece, it's going to be everywhere. So how can you have a global economy if your sense of empathy only extends to your national family? This is at foreign minister, you must have faced this over and over again. How can you have a global economy if your empathy and social trust extends to a national boundary? Economy comes from the word oikos. Oikos means family. Economy means extended family. So the first economy was forager-hunters, tribal. Then the next family became the great hydrological civilizations based on religious association. The next economies became the nation states on extended family. There's no way to create a global economy without extending empathy and seeing ourselves as a human family. It will not be done. There's a paradox to history. That's the empathy entropy paradox that you mentioned. It's kind of a bittersweet, sad paradox, really, when you think about it. The same more complex civilizations that use more energy, but then bring more people together in more complex arrangements, and new communications that extend the central nervous system do make us more empathic, but they use more energy. And there are examples over history of civilizations with great empathic surges and then terrible entropic collapse. Ancient Rome being the best example. Brought together diverse people around the world with a lot of energy, and the energy was, after conquest, the energy was agriculture across the Mediterranean, taxing that soil base for 2/3 of the revenue to keep the empire going. But it brought all these diverse people together, And first century Rome, all these upwardly mobile, existentially alone individuals who had been knocked out of their blood ties and tribal ties, they were ready for the Jesus story and urban Christianity, one of the great empathic surges in history. But by the 4th century, the soil base was gone, and Rome collapsed before the hordes were at the gate. 6 centuries to restore the possibilities of moving life forward. How do we break the empathy-entropy conundrum at this point in history? Because I think all of us in this room glimpse the possibility of thinking as a human race. I'm not, with all the blowbacks, and we're not going to get there soon, right? We can once in a while glimpse the possibilities of thinking as a human race. When the disaster hit Haiti, the earthquake, within an hour some Twitters were coming out and YouTube videos, and within 2 hours the whole human race was viscerally there and visually there with a massive empathic response. Yes, short-lived, but you can't, nobody's going to be there with Haiti the rest of the life, but it was there. If we were, as the Enlightenment philosophers suggest, individuals who are calculating, rational, detached, pursuing our self-interest, how would you account for that response in Haiti? So we can glimpse the possibility of, I'll give you another example. You know, there was a little video taken, I'm sure you all saw it, of a polar bear and her cub, I think it was last year, on the ice floes in the open Arctic waters in the summer, and there was one little ice floe they were left on trapped, the bear and her cub. And you knew they were slipping off that ice from climate change, drought. How many have seen that video? And the human race saw it, and it was in a massive empathic response. Not just to that individual bear and her cub, but we saw them in ourselves and in all of our fellow creatures, and the familiarity, the sense that we are all the same. It registered home. That's biosphere consciousness. Our kids in the schools, the 12-year-olds here in Berlin are Skyping on the computer and doing classwork with kids in Tokyo, and they all know each other's names when they're doing the class project. That's the human race. Our kids are taught in the schools, and this is a revolution, they don't even know it is one. Maybe if they did, we wouldn't have done it. But our teachers are teaching the kids, your kids, from first grade, that everything they do, the electricity they use, the food they eat, the clothes they wear, the family car, their whole day, whatever they do, affects the well-being of someone somewhere else. It could be a farmer and his family or her family 10,000 miles away that are experiencing climate change drought because of the way I live here in Berlin, correct? That's brand new. That's biosphere politics. That's not geopolitics. That's the shift you tried to bring when you were foreign minister. But we now glimpse also that just as we're to get to that summit of global consciousness, we can feel our own extinction, the democratization of weapons of mass destruction, and climate change coming down like a dark cloak on the human race. How do we break this paradox, empathy, entropy? We are on the cusp of a third industrial revolution. And you and I have talked about this many times, a convergence of communication and energy. It could give us distributed consciousness for the next generation. I don't know if we'll get there in time. I really don't. There's no safeguards or fail-safes in history. History's mercurial. It depends on leaders. It depends on chance circumstances. But the European Union has committed itself to 4 pillars of a third industrial revolution, signed and sealed by the European Parliament under Hans Pottering's leadership, and to a great extent Germany's leadership. A new convergence of communication and energy. We know that we had a very profound communication revolution in the last 10 years, the personal computer and the internet. This is what we call distributed communication. First communication revolution, electricity, was top-down, television, radio, cinema. The new communication, 2 billion people can take a little device in their hand and send their own video, audio, and text to everyone else, distributed, everyone at the same time, speed of light, all in 10 years. This distributed information communication revolution is just now beginning to converge with a new energy revolution, distributed energy. When distributed communication organizes distributed energy, we have a third industrial revolution and maybe distributed consciousness. The EU is committed, at least on paper, and now we're trying to see how we move it out, to these four-pillar infrastructure of the third industrial revolution. Pillar one, 20% renewable energy by 2020. That was under Chancellor Merkel in your direction. That was the commitment under the presidency of Germany. Done deal. Pillar two, buildings. Buildings are the major cause of CO2. And actually, number two cause is beef production and consumption. I always have to say that when I'm here in meat-producing countries. Number three is worldwide transport. We always talk about 1 and 3. No one seems to get to 2. Although Minister Gabriel was the first environmental minister in the world to actually say this is number 2. Only one minister in the world. But buildings are the problem, they're the solution. What we envision in Pillar 2 is every single building in Europe in the next 30 years converted to a partial power plant. Germany's doing it more than anyone else. Solar roofs, vertical wind, heat under the ground, because these energies are distributed. Elite energies are not. Coal, oil, gas, and uranium is not in your backyard when you go home tonight. But the other energies in some proportion are. So renewable energies, the wind, the sun, the heat, the garbage, the agricultural waste, the ocean tides, they're distributed all across the planet. So Pillar 2, we're imagining, excuse me? Yeah, if you have the grids. Well, we get into Pillar 4, which you have championed. Pillar 2, we want to imagine all the buildings collecting the energy around the buildings. Pillar 3, we're going to store it because the sun isn't always shining in Berlin. Sometimes the wind isn't blowing. So we have to put in hydrogen and other storage to store these energies. We made that commitment in the EU in 2002, and then under the Merkel-Steinmeier coalition, you introduced 500 million euro hydrogen storage research for Germany. I had suggested that to you and the Chancellor. You did it. Pillar 4 is what you're saying, when the communication revolution combines with the energy revolution to give us a new industrial revolution. We use the same technology that created the internet. Identical. We take the power grid of Germany and Europe and turn it to an intergrid that acts like the internet. So that when millions and millions of buildings across 27 member states, 500 million people from Irish Sea to Russia, when they're generating just a little bit of energy in their own buildings, storing it with hydrogen like you store digital with media, what you don't need, send it across the intergrid peer-to-peer, just like you share information on the internet. This is a distributed economic revolution. This stretches capitalism laterally because everyone's a player, but it requires a new social model because it has to be shared collaboratively across continents, just like on the internet. It requires each individual being entrepreneurial, but you have to collaborate in social spaces. The new divide politically, and I've noticed this, and I would be curious if you've noticed this, the new divide politically is not so much right or left. It's really between those who think patriarchal, centralized, and top-down, and those who think distributed, open social commons and shared spaces. It's quite interesting. It's a generational divide to some extent. If we can get to a third industrial revolution, it helps shape distributed consciousness. Because if we begin to connect the central nervous system so everybody is distributing their intelligence and their communication, so we're connected on the blogosphere, and then we distribute our energy so each of us is responsible for our part of the biosphere, it allows us to think as human beings nestled and embedded in one biosphere with our fellow creatures because we're actually doing it. If someone else isn't doing it for us, we understand that we're the ones responsible for each other because we're connected with a distributed communication energy civilization. It isn't panacea. It won't end all of our problems. We'll still be fighting. And remember, every family has squabbles, but when it comes together, one deeply empathizes and comes to each other's well-being, correct? Last thoughts on this. A lot of parents will come up to me and say, can we do this? I don't know. I don't know. Do we have enough time? I don't know. But I know that consciousness changes very quickly when energy and communication revolutions come in. They all accompany each other. I'll give you an example of just one little example. There's so many. How many of you looked at in the mirror today? What, don't you groom yourself? How many looked in the mirror? Okay, now, you don't have to be ashamed of that. You've got to groom yourself, but Isn't it interesting to know that people never actually got a good look at themselves until the 1400s? Oh, yes. There were no mirrors. You could see yourself in a pond of water. You could see yourself in a piece of metal. But in the 1400s, off Venice and Murano, they began to mass produce mirrors. And they'd give the mirrors as a free gift with a book. All of a sudden, big national pastime across Europe, looking in mirrors. It became almost an interesting thing to do. There's me. There's you. This was not entertainment. Because as people began to actually look at their defining features very carefully, they would see a self. And then could easily discriminate how unique their self is compared to someone else, but what the similarities were. That's where we came up with the word self-reflection. Mirrors. And we developed a deeper sense of selfhood. It's just one of many examples. A deeper sense of selfhood that allowed us to then understand each other's personal history as unique. Amazing. I'll give you an example. We have some baby boomers here. Remember when the Apollo spaceship took its last round across the dark side of the moon? And then our boys shot some photographs of the Earth in color from the sun? Every single baby boomer in here, you put those posters on the wall, correct? The Earth from outer space. That was an out-of-body experience. For the first time we saw the Earth from the outside in. That gave us a sense of how small it is and that we can be from the inside out. We're embedded. It was a big deal. Your kids and grandchildren are doing this every day. How many here are under the age of 25? Raise your hand. Everyone under 25 in here? 30? You must be. How many of you are under 25 in here? I don't have very many. Our kids go up on Google Maps every day. I was just at Google headquarters last week. You go up on a Google map with a satellite photo, and if you want to take a look at a building 20,000 miles away, you zoom down from outer space right into the window, correct? That's an out-of-body experience because we have the technology to connect the human race so we see how embedded we are. Will we get there in time? I'll leave you with a final thought. Has anybody here taken their National Geographic DNA test? Oh, we're in Berlin. It's so cosmopolitan. One guy. Thank you. You saved the Berliners. What's pretty interesting? You send $100 to the National Geographic magazine website. They send you a kit. My wife and I and my in-laws did this. You take DNA from the cheek and put it in the kit and send it back to the genetics lab. They analyze your DNA and then tell you where you migrated from, your family, all the way back to the beginning of life. Wild. But they tell us something else. I'm going to save everyone $100, all right? They tell us something else. I didn't know this. Apparently, 175,000 years ago, in the Rift Valley of Africa, there were about 10,000 anatomically modern human beings walking those grasslands. The geneticists have located one woman as a database line. They call her the mitochondrial DNA Eve. Apparently, her genes spread to everyone in this room tonight. The other ladies didn't. Then it gets even more strange. They found one man. He's a database line. They call him the Y chromosome Adam. Apparently this guy was pretty potent. His genes passed to everyone in this room tonight. The other guys didn't make it. Here's the news. All 6.8 billion people and all of our different forms of consciousness, our conflicts, our pathology, our misery, we're all part of the same family. It could have been many lineages. And the Bible got this one completely right. We have to think as Homo empathicus. We have to prepare an empathic civilization. We have to move to global empathy before we get to an abyss with global entropy. And I don't know of any other country better suited to this mission than Germany. I truly believe that Germany is the powerhouse of Europe, and Europe is the laboratory and conscience for the world. And I said this at the Chancery today. Especially Germany, which has struggled for so long with the light and dark sides of existence. Here's a country that produced Goethe and Schopenhauer, but it also produced the Holocaust. Here's a country that has had to wrestle with quick changing movements from one energy and communication revolution to the other. You had to move from a feudal economy overnight to a modern industrial economy, the old sense of identity, the old sense of us and other, it was completely thrown aside, terror and panic, and there was a psychological meltdown here in the 30s. So I don't know of any better laboratory, because we have 3 generations of Germans here who have really been the conscience of the world for the last 50 years. So the question is it possible that Germany can lead Europe and Europe can lead the world into an empathic civilization? By example, if we can imagine that, we should begin a great discussion. My sense is that we are ready for this conversation. I see it, all the telltale marks everywhere I go. There was a great conversation during the Enlightenment about human nature. Why shouldn't we have one today? Started here in Germany. And my hope is that all the generations alive today, we can begin to explore our core nature, empathy, and develop institutions that reflect it. And I'll leave you with the deathbed test. This is, my wife talks about the deathbed test. This is a good test for every one of us in the room, including me. My wife says, think about when you're on your deathbed and go back and look at life and see what counted. And when you go back and look at life when you're 65 or 70, the important moments were not when you were autonomous or self-serving or utilitarian or materialistic. Those weren't the important moments. The important moments when you look back in life, photographs of life, are the empathic moments. When we reached out and transcended ourselves and actually felt super alive by being with somebody else's struggle to flourish and be, correct? And we think about our siblings, we think about our companion animals, we think about all the moments in life where we actually transcended ourselves and became part of other people's lives and rooted for their struggle, correct? So we don't need a scientist to tell us this. What we do need now is the social and political commitment to make this happen. So my hope, put this 3rd industrial revolution in place. Have a new conversation for the human race. Make sure that this awe-striking reality called life is allowed to continue. Make sure that all the human beings not yet here and all the other creatures not yet on earth, let them have their moment to be awestruck by life. On whatever level, that wolf baying at the moon has a right to be awestruck by their journey and their level, just like we do. And if we can do that, our legacy will be that we've helped preserve this special little experiment in the universe. It's a worthy mission. Good night.